Let me just be real with you for one moment. You don't lack options, you just lack the belief that you deserve better. And until that changes, nothing in your life will ever change. And I say that with all the love in my heart, because I've been exactly right where you are. I've sat in that same spot that you're sitting in, convincing myself that what I had was good enough. It was okay. I should be grateful. I knew that it was a lie. I just felt stuck. If you've ever stayed in something for too long that has been quietly or loudly draining you, you're calling it patience, you're calling it loyalty, you're calling it love. I need you to stay with me, stay focused, because this video has been created for you. By the end of this video, I know that something is about to shift inside of you. Hey beautiful, you're welcome to Vibes with V, which was previously called Diamond Live. If you're new here, oh my goodness, I am so glad that you found this channel. My name is Victory, but literally everybody calls me V. If you've known me outside of YouTube, you might know me as 𝗵𝗲𝗽𝗍𝗑. So take your favorite. My favorite way to introduce myself is as V or 𝗵𝗲𝗽. On this channel, we talk about real life things, real stuff. So if you're a young, ambitious woman who loves Jesus and you would like to defeat self-doubt, defeat fear, insecurity, and any kind of limitation that has been placed on you by either yourself or the society, so that you can rise up in boldness to chase your dreams and your goals, then I want you to know that you have come to the right place. Why don't you hit that red subscribe button and turn on the notification bell as well, so that every time I release a new video that's powerful like this, you will be notified and you will not miss out. Before we get into the meat and potatoes of this video, I would like to address something quickly, especially for those of you who've been following me for a very long time. So you probably noticed that I went silent for a few months. Honestly, it wasn't planned, I promise. Life just happened and I went quiet, no announcement, nothing. But in summary, it was basically a season that God was taking me on. God was working through me in a certain way, and it's something that I just could not rush, because if I rushed it, I knew that I would not be where I am today. It was a situation that God has to take me on, and I couldn't come on camera pretending that everything was honky-dory, pretending like I was happy, because if you know me, you know that I'm all about authenticity. I'm all about being real and being transparent, and I could not come on here encouraging you, telling you to do certain things with your life, meanwhile I was breaking down, meanwhile I was going through depression, amongst many other things. But I'm happy to say that I am finally in a position where I can come on camera, I can be authentic, be myself, still encourage you, and not feel like I'm an imposter and not feel like I'm faking it. I can actually come on here and really do what God has called me to do. Number one, you have normalized what hurt you. The truth of the matter is, the things that were hurting you, you just got used to them. You stopped calling them painful and you started calling them your new normal. You stopped seeing these things as red flags or red billboards, like I like to call them, and you start seeing it as, you know, a normal situation. You know, you started telling yourself, oh, that's just how life is, oh, that's just how people are, oh, that's just how men are, that's just how women are, that's just how jobs are, etc., etc. But that is not true, my dear. Whoever told you that was lying to you. So I want you to stop believing that foolishness, because it is not normal, and you must end that belief right now. Are you with me? When you are in a survival mode for a very long time, a lot of things start becoming blurred. You know, the lines became blurred. You start seeing things that were abnormal before as normal. You forget what it looks like to be thriving, and you just settle for second best. I remember a situation, actually. I was dealing with this guy, let's call him K for the sake of this video, right? When K and I were dating, I don't even know why I stayed in that situation for that long, because when I think back at it, I'm just like, hey V, why did you do that to yourself? But anyway, back to the story. So K and I were dating, right? And every time we had a situation, this guy would legit disappear on me. It wasn't like he would disappear for like maybe a day, 2 days, or even 3 days. No, honey. He would disappear from me for like 2 months, 3 months, sometimes even longer. When I was dating this guy, I'm telling you, it was so crazy because I even had a fight with my then male best friend, and this K guy, honestly, I just think he was a master manipulator. Not even I think, I know now that he was a master manipulator. Because what do you mean by you're disappearing on somebody that you claim that you love? I was just there falling apart, you know, crying, overthinking, thinking like, what have I done so wrong? Like, what, like even the argument, when I think about it, it was even his fault. But anyway, let's not go into that. So like some of the arguments, yes, I triggered it, but most of them, it was his fault. And I was just thinking like, why am I, you know, falling apart for this guy, you know, and I'm just crying, I'm just being upset. Meanwhile, he's living his life. So the minute that I decide, okay, do you know what, that's it, we're done, we're, you know, not talking to each other anymore, let's just move on, boom, the guy will appear into my life like nothing happened, and I will forget the fact that I was supposed to be angry with this guy, I was supposed to be upset with him. The only time that he will reach out to me was when he needed something from me, and usually came in a financial support request, and just like an olodo, I will show up for him again, and the same cycle repeated for a very long time. Do you know the funny thing is, whilst we were dating, there was a point in my life that if not for God, I'm telling you, I would have legitimately used my money to give this guy to build a house, because he was claiming that he was building a house for me and him, but not knowing he had other plans. This guy wanted to use me as a ladder to climb up, and to an extent he did, because I even helped him relocate to the United States of America, but that's a story for another day. Can any of you relate? If you can, I want you to be honest and drop it in the comment section for me, so I know that I'm not the only one. If this is something that you can relate with, I want you to save this video, because I promise you there will be times when you will come back to this video, so that it will help you in your journey of healing. And whilst you are there, why don't you share this video with about 3 ladies who you know will benefit from this video, somebody who you know that is going through something similar to my story, and it will help them get up out of that situation that they are in and rise up to become the queens that God has created them to become. Number 2, your identity still needs healing. Yep, I said it and I'm gonna say it again. Your identity still needs healing. See, when I understood this, my life legitimately did a whole 180 degrees turnaround. You're not settling because you're weak or you're damaged. No, you're settling because your identity has been damaged a lot and it needs to be healed. In the past, people may have rejected you, people may have dismissed you, people may have even overlooked you, people may have also made you feel like you're doing too much or you're not enough. Over the time, right, these things had built up because you haven't dealt with it, and as they build up, it got to a point where you now started using the opinion of people as your landmark, as your guide, instead of using the word of God, instead of using the things that God has said specifically about you as a guide into your life. You now allow the opinions of people shape you. And do you want to know the scariest part? Some of these people may actually be members of your own household. Yes, I said it. Before you realize it, inconsistency starts to feel normal. Bare minimum and crumbs starts to feel like that's just how life is. Before you know it, you start calling it humility. You start calling it not being too demanding. But my darling, that is a wound that has not yet been treated. So you might be asking, okay V, so how do you know this? My dear, I have lived this for a very long time, like for so much of my life, and that's one of the reasons I'm very passionate about equipping young women like yourself to defeat all these limitations. You see, for a very long time I played small in relationship, whether that be friendship or romantic relationship. Heck, even in the job that I went for, I played so small. So that's why I know for a fact that you are settling, and enough is enough, because the women that God created, they are not small. They are queens that rise up to take their destinies in their own hands, to be a voice in their generation that will leave an impact in the lives of even the unborn generations. It took me a very long time before I realized that the problem wasn't my abilities, the problem was my belief. The problem was because that my identity hadn't been healed. And my love, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Just because something feels comfortable or familiar, it doesn't mean that that is right for you, and it definitely doesn't mean that that's God's plan for you, that that's what God wants you to do. So many of you listening to me out there right now, you have gotten so used to discomfort that you have basically built a tent and made it your permanent home. But God had sent me to tell you this, that it's time for you to pack out and move out. It's time for you to pull down those tents and get out of there, because enough is enough. 3, you are so scared to let it go. Oh, I know I just hit some nerves. Deep down, you already know that something is not right for you. In fact, God has been speaking to you in many ways than one, either through visions, through signs, through prophetic words. When you think of letting something or someone go, there are so many questions that begin to flood through your head. You begin to think, what if something better doesn't come along? What if this is the best that I could ever get? If I leave this man now, will I ever find true love again? Will I ever find genuine love again? Is it not better for me to stay in this relationship? Because you hear the saying, half bread is better than none. So you think, oh, let me just stay with this half bread, it's better than not having anything. But my dear, I'm telling you, chuck that bread away, because you deserve better. I cannot count the amount of times that I was in that situation myself, whether it be relationship, whether it be friendship or work situation. The most annoying one was definitely the work situation, because I used to shrink myself so much time, like even jobs that I knew I should not be doing, I just kept staying there because, you know, it's better than nothing, and I had bills to pay. There was this guy I was dating, right, and I was holding on to him for dear life. Even though God was speaking to me, like God had showed me in dreams, God had showed me through like conversations, like signs, like at this point God had literally not just shown me red flags, he showed me red billboards. In fact, the entire street was painted in red, but I still stayed because I was trying to make things work. Like I've invested so much time and resources into this relationship, like I didn't want to let it go. But just like a barbed wire, if you're holding onto a barbed wire, if you don't let it go, it will cut you. And that's what it was happening to me. I was getting caught in different ways. In the process of the relationship, I lost myself, I lost my sanity, I lost so much things about myself. I didn't know who I was anymore. It was a shadow of who God created me to be. And that's what happens when you end up in the wrong relationship. That's what happens when you refuse to let things go that God has told you to let it go. I decided to pray that dangerous prayer that I always pray. You know that prayer that I'm talking about? Yes, that one. I told God, and I said to God, if this man is not my husband, if this man is not supposed to be in my life, I want you to take him out of my life. Make me lose the feelings that I have for him, because I'm telling you, I loved this guy like, yo, I felt stuck, like I couldn't move, like it just felt like I was in some kind of chains, some kind of bondage, but I couldn't free myself from that situation. So I needed God to come through. I asked God to take him away if he was not my husband. I was tired of going through that pain. I was tired of that breadcrumbs kind of relationship. When I prayed that prayer, my idea, the kind of speed that God used to answer that prayer, me myself, I shook. I'm telling you, because out of the blue, he ghosted me. Like I couldn't reach him anymore. His number was not going through. It was like he was completely vanished out of the face of the earth. Even his Facebook account, he was not using it anymore. It hurt so much. Like it felt like a knife was used to stab my heart in so many different ways. Even in the process, I almost committed suicide, but I'm so grateful to God that God is an amazing Father. God really healed me throughout that process. Like, he took me on a journey that I got through. He really healed me in ways that I didn't even know. Like, I was broken in so many places that I didn't even know. And I think like a few years ago, I encountered this gentleman again, and I was speaking to him on the phone, and after speaking to him, I was just like, wow, I am so grateful I did not marry you. On the other side of pain and heartbreak lays a different version of you, a version that when you come out on the other side, you will be so glad you went through that process and healed. After that situation, I literally became someone else. I was more confident. I started knowing what my value really is. I stopped accepting breadcrumbs. If that barbed wire is hurting your hands right now, I really need you to let it go. Release it to God. Let him take over, because he's the only one that can fight that battle for you. He's the only one that can take you on that healing journey. So just let it go and leave it to God. If you would like my support to help you as well, the details on that is in the description. You just need to book a free 30 minutes conversation with me, and let's have a chat and see how we can work together. Everything that I've shared today with you is not because I have it all figured out. No, that could not be further from the truth at all. I have sat in that position that you're in right now, and I know what it costs. I know the cost that comes when you stay in a place for way too long that you should have stayed. I know what it takes to stay in a toxic relationship, in a toxic work environment, heck, even in a toxic family and friend environment. Because you know what? When you stay in that situation, it costs you your confidence, it costs you your self-esteem, and I actually know what's waiting for you on the other side if you just choose to believe, if you just choose to take that appropriate step. If you haven't already done so, I'd like you to share this video with at least one woman who you know will benefit from this. You know, that woman that whilst you've been listening to me speaking, she came into your mind. I want you to share this video with her, because I promise you might just change her life, because she may have just been waiting and praying to God for an answer, and this video might just be that answer that she needs. And whilst you are there, why don't you hit that red subscribe button and the bell icon, so that you will be notified every time I release powerful videos just like this one. There's a reason that God put people into communities, and I would like to invite you to join us at Queens of Virtue community. The link to join us is in the description below. You might be asking me, what is Queens of Virtue? So Queens of Virtue is a sisterhood dedicated to empowering you and equipping you to rise up to become who God has called you to be. We are always there for one another. We pray for one another. We have different events where we go out to socialize, we mingle, we discuss different topics both virtually and in person. Like, there's so much more to Queens of Virtue that I could say in this video, but the only way you will find out is when you join us. So why don't you click that link in the description below and join us. Make sure you answer all the questions, and once you join, you also receive a very special gift from me. Until next time, when I come your way again, remember that you are a queen. So rise up, fix your crown, walk like the daughter of Jehovah that you are. Let your light so shine for the world to see. I'll see you in the next one.